Welcome back to Neighborhood Nightmares, where we share incredible true stories about property disputes that turned ordinary neighborhoods into battlegrounds. Today's story is absolutely wild. Imagine hosting your daughter's graduation pool party only to discover that half of your backyard has been turned into your neighbor's personal resort without your permission. But that's not even the craziest part. When my HOA-obsessed neighbor decided to build an illegal swimming pool extending onto my property line, I never expected it would end with me legally draining their entire pool during their fancy summer soirée. And trust me, the looks on their faces when their expensive champagne party turned into a muddy disaster were absolutely priceless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But before we dive into this absolutely insane story of entitlement and sweet revenge, let me paint you a picture of life in Willow Creek Estates, one of those pristine suburban developments in Northern Virginia where every blade of grass has to be exactly 2 inches tall, and your mailbox color needs to match your shutters down to the exact shade. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not usually one for drama. In fact, for the past 15 years, I've been that quiet neighbor who always follows the rules, keeps their garden immaculate, and never causes any trouble. I'm the kind of person who actually reads those lengthy HOA newsletters and makes sure my holiday decorations come down exactly 14 days after the celebration. That all changed when the Hendersons moved in next door. Picture this: a family so obsessed with keeping up appearances that they actually hired a professional photographer to take pictures of their house for the neighborhood directory. Sarah Henderson, with her perfectly highlighted hair and perpetual yoga outfit, made it her mission to become the queen bee of our HOA board. Her husband, Richard, a corporate lawyer who never missed an opportunity to mention his Harvard degree, spent most weekends measuring his neighbor's fence heights with a laser level. But here's where things get interesting. And believe me, you'll want to stick around for this one. What started as a simple property line dispute turned into an all-out war when the Hendersons decided that their precious little piece of suburbia needed something extra special, a resort-style pool, complete with a waterfall and swim-up bar. The only problem? Their lot wasn't big enough for their grandiose plans. So what did they do? They just assumed they could use part of my property because, and I quote, "it's just wasted space anyway." Let me tell you, nothing prepares you for the moment you come home from a 12-hour nursing shift to find construction crews digging up your prized rose garden. But that was just the beginning. What followed was a months-long saga of lies, manipulation, and some of the most entitled behavior I've ever witnessed in my 15 years of living in an HOA community. From fake permits to midnight construction work, the Hendersons thought they could get away with anything until they messed with the wrong neighbor. Now, I know what you're thinking. Just call the authorities, right? Well, buckle up, because this story takes more twists and turns than their illegally installed water slide. By the time I was done, not only did I manage to get sweet revenge in the most spectacular way possible, but I also exposed years of HOA corruption and ended up saving our entire neighborhood from what I later discovered was a massive real estate scheme. So if you've ever dealt with entitled neighbors, corrupt HOA boards, or just love a good story about justice being served pool style, you're in for a treat. And trust me, the way this all ends, let's just say karma comes with a waterproof warranty, and sometimes the best revenge is served not just cold, but completely drained. But before we dive into all the juicy details of how this suburban pool party turned into an epic neighborhood showdown, make sure you're ready for a story that'll make your worst neighbor seem like a saint in comparison. And let me warn you, what happened at the Hendersons' infamous summer splash soirée is something our neighborhood still talks about to this day. Now, before we continue with this absolutely wild story of pool drama and sweet revenge, I want to take a moment to talk to all of you amazing people who keep coming back to Neighborhood Nightmares week after week. Your support has been absolutely incredible, and the way this community has grown in the past year still blows my mind. We started with just a few hundred subscribers sharing their crazy neighbor stories, and now we're approaching 500,000 strong. That's 500,000 people who understand exactly what it's like to deal with entitled neighbors, ridiculous HOA rules, and property line disputes that make you question humanity. Speaking of our incredible community, I've been reading through your comments from last week's story about the neighbor who built a spite fence made entirely of old Christmas decorations. And let me tell you, your own stories in the comments were absolutely hilarious. Special shout out to username 92, who shared that amazing story about their neighbor who installed security cameras disguised as garden gnomes. I literally spat out my coffee reading that one. And to everyone who shared their own HOA horror stories, you're the reason this channel keeps growing and becoming more amazing every single day. For those of you who are new here, and I can see from our analytics that we're getting lots of new faces every day, welcome to your new favorite corner of YouTube. If you're dealing with neighbor drama, HOA nightmares, or just love hearing about sweet, sweet karma being served, you're in the right place. We post new stories 3 times a week, and let me tell you, each one is more unbelievable than the last. But here's the thing, they're all true, verified stories from real people who've dealt with real neighbor nightmares. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. These stories can't possibly be real. Trust me, I sometimes wish they weren't. But as someone who's lived through their fair share of neighbor drama, and you're about to hear one of my craziest stories yet, I can tell you that truth is often stranger than fiction. That's why we have such a strict verification process for all our stories. We fact-check everything, collect documentation, and make sure we're only sharing genuine experiences that can help others deal with similar situations. And speaking of helping others, that's really what this channel is all about. Sure, we love a good revenge story, and boy, do I have one for you today. But more importantly, we're building a community where people can learn from each other's experiences. Every week, I get dozens of messages from subscribers telling me how they used advice from our comments section to resolve their own neighbor disputes. That's what makes this all worthwhile. So if you're new here and haven't hit that subscribe button yet, what are you waiting for? Join our amazing community of neighborhood warriors, and don't forget to hit that notification bell. Trust me, you don't want to miss our upcoming stories. We've got some absolute doozies lined up, including one about a neighbor who tried to claim adverse possession of someone's entire house while they were on vacation. Yeah, that one's going to be wild. And for all my regular viewers, you know who you are, you beautiful people. Thank you for continuing to share your own stories in the comments. Your experiences help others feel less alone in their neighbor struggles, and sometimes they even provide solutions that people hadn't thought of. Plus, I read every single comment. Yes, even the ones posted at 3 a.m. And I love seeing how this community supports each other. Now, if you're ready to hear about how my neighbor's illegal pool party turned into the most satisfying revenge story this channel has ever featured, and trust me, it's a doozy. Make sure you're comfortable. Grab your favorite beverage, maybe some popcorn, because this story has everything: entitled neighbors, corrupt HOA boards, illegal construction, and the sweetest pool-draining revenge you could possibly imagine. And the best part? Every single word of it is documented with security footage, legal papers, and enough evidence to make even the most skeptical viewer believe. Now, without any further delay, let's dive right into this absolutely insane story that'll make you think twice about ever crossing your neighbors, especially if they happen to know a thing or two about property law and water management systems. And trust me, after spending 15 years as a civil engineer specializing in municipal water systems, I know exactly how to handle a problematic pool situation. But before I get into the juicy details of how the Hendersons' grand pool party turned into a muddy disaster, I need to give you some important context. Because this isn't just a story about an illegal pool or entitled neighbors. It's about how a small group of privileged homeowners tried to turn our peaceful community into their personal playground, and how their arrogance ultimately led to their downfall. You see, Willow Creek Estates wasn't always the kind of place where people built illegal pools or tried to steal their neighbors' land. When I first moved here in 2008, it was a modest but well-maintained community where people actually knew their neighbors and looked out for each other. We had reasonable HOA rules that made sense. Keep your lawn maintained, don't paint your house neon colors, that sort of thing. Nothing crazy or excessive. But everything started to change about 5 years ago when property values in our area skyrocketed. Suddenly, our little community became desirable real estate, and we started seeing an influx of what I like to call nouveau suburban royalty. People who thought that buying a house in our neighborhood meant they could remake it in their own image, regardless of existing rules or their neighbors' rights. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Hendersons were just the latest in this wave of entitled newcomers, but they were by far the worst. And what makes this story particularly interesting is how they managed to align themselves with several other problematic neighbors to form what we started calling the Pool Party Coalition. A group of homeowners who seemed to think that our HOA rules only applied to other people, never to them. Now I should mention that I've changed some names and minor details to protect people's privacy and avoid any more legal drama, but everything I'm about to tell you is documented, verified, and backed up by security footage, legal papers, and dozens of witnesses. In fact, some of those witnesses are probably watching this video right now. Hey there, Carol from number 387. I know you're still mad about what happened to your prize-winning petunias during all this drama, but I'm getting ahead of myself. To really understand how things escalated to the point where I was legally justified in draining my neighbor's pool during their fancy party, you need to understand the perfect storm of entitlement, corruption, and plain old bad judgment that led up to that moment. And believe me, by the time I'm done telling this story, you'll understand exactly why I did what I did, and why most of our neighborhood actually stood up and applauded when it happened. So grab your notepads, because this story contains some valuable lessons about property rights, HOA regulations, and why you should always check the property lines before you start digging up your neighbor's rose garden. And for those of you who've been dealing with similar situations in your own neighborhoods, pay close attention to how I documented everything, because proper documentation is what ultimately saved me from what could have been a very expensive lawsuit. But most importantly, get ready for a story that proves sometimes the best revenge isn't served cold. It's served completely drained, right in the middle of what was supposed to be the social event of the season. And trust me, watching a bunch of entitled neighbors in their designer swimwear suddenly realize their illegal pool party is quite literally going down the drain. That's the kind of satisfaction you can't put a price on. And for those wondering, if I went too far, well, stick around until the end of the story. Because once you hear about everything the Hendersons and their pool party coalition did leading up to that moment, I think you'll agree that my response was actually pretty restrained. After all, I could have waited until after they served the expensive champagne to start the draining process, but I'm not that petty. Well, maybe just a little. So this particular saga, which we'll call the Great Pool Party Drain of 2024, started on what seemed like a perfectly normal spring morning in Willow Creek Estates. I was out in my garden, tending to my award-winning hydrangeas. And yes, they really were award-winning, having taken first place in the county's botanical competition 3 years running. These weren't just any flowers. They were the result of 15 years of careful cultivation, specific soil pH balancing, and more love and attention than most people give their houseplants in a lifetime. I mention these hydrangeas specifically because they become pretty important to our story later on. You see, they weren't just flowers to me. They were living proof that sometimes the best things in life take time, patience, and respect for natural boundaries. Unlike certain neighbors I could mention who think they can just bulldoze their way to instant backyard paradise. It was around 7:30 a.m. when I first heard the rumbling of heavy machinery coming from the Hendersons' property. Now, in most normal neighborhoods, the sound of construction equipment at 7:30 in the morning would be cause for concern. But in Willow Creek Estates, it had become almost commonplace ever since the Hendersons and their friends started their home improvement crusade. Still, something felt different about this particular morning. The machinery sounded closer than usual, and there was this sort of nervous energy in the air. You know that feeling you get when you just know something bad is about to happen? Well, multiply that by about 1,000, and you'll have some idea of what I was experiencing as I stood there in my bathrobe, coffee cup in hand, watching a massive excavator roll down our shared driveway. At first, I thought maybe they were finally fixing that ridiculous fountain they'd installed last summer. The one that looked like 3 golden dolphins doing synchronized swimming while spitting water at passing cars. But then I noticed something odd. The excavator wasn't heading toward their yard. It was positioning itself right along our property line, its massive metal arm extending over my precious hydrangea beds. Now, here's where I should mention that I'm not one of those neighbors who freaks out over every little thing. In fact, my previous interactions with the Hendersons, while not exactly friendly, had been civil enough. Sure, there was that time Sarah tried to report me to the HOA for having bird feeders that weren't architecturally consistent with the neighborhood aesthetic. And yes, Richard had made several passive-aggressive comments about my vintage Volvo, bringing down property values. But I'd managed to maintain my cool through all of that. But watching that excavator hover over my garden, something told me we were about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And boy, was I right, because what happened next set off a chain of events that would not only change the dynamics of our entire neighborhood, but would also expose a web of corruption that went far deeper than anyone could have imagined. As I stood there, still in my bathrobe, I noticed Sarah Henderson strutting across her lawn in what I can only describe as construction chic. Designer hard hat, pristine white coveralls, and what looked like brand new Louboutin work boots. I'm not kidding. Who wears red-bottom shoes to a construction site? But that was Sarah for you, always dressed for the Instagram photo op rather than the actual occasion. She was carrying what looked like a stack of papers, and the smirk on her face made my stomach drop. You know that expression people get when they think they've completely outsmarted everyone around them? That's the look Sarah had that morning. It was the same look she'd had when she managed to get herself elected as HOA president through what many of us suspected was a very creative interpretation of the voting bylaws. Little did I know that those papers in her hand would turn out to be the most poorly forged construction permits I'd ever seen. And trust me, after 15 years in civil engineering, I've seen some doozies. But we'll get to that part of the story soon. Enough, because what happened next would make those fake permits look like small potatoes compared to the absolute chaos that was about to unfold in our once peaceful suburban paradise. Let me give you some crucial background about Willow Creek Estates and how things got to this point, because, trust me, this kind of audacious behavior doesn't just happen overnight. Our community was originally built in the late 1990s as a modest development for middle-class families. We're talking teachers, nurses, civil servants, people who wanted a nice, quiet place to raise their kids without breaking the bank. The original HOA rules were pretty straightforward. Keep your lawn maintained, don't paint your house crazy colors, And be considerate of your neighbors. Basic stuff that any reasonable person would agree with. We had quarterly meetings in the community center, and the biggest drama usually involved someone's unauthorized bird bath or a fence that was 2 inches too tall, normal suburban stuff. But everything changed when they built the Golden Valley Country Club just 2 miles down the road in 2020. Suddenly, our little neighborhood became what real estate agents call strategically located. Property values tripled almost overnight, and that's when we started seeing a very different type of homeowner moving in. I'm talking about people who saw our community not as a place to live, but as a stepping stone to social climbing. The Hendersons were part of this new wave, but they weren't just any nouveau riche wannabes. Oh no, they had a plan. You see, Richard Henderson wasn't just a corporate lawyer, he specialized in real estate development. And Sarah? Before becoming a full-time lifestyle influencer, her words, not mine, she'd worked in property management. They knew exactly what they were doing when they bought the worst house in our neighborhood. Now let me paint you a picture of their property versus mine. My lot is on the east side, carefully landscaped over 15 years with native plants, a small vegetable garden, and of course, my prize hydrangeas. The previous owners of the Hendersons lot had maintained a beautiful Japanese-inspired garden with a small koi pond. Within 2 weeks of moving in, the Hendersons had ripped out every single tree and bush, filled in the pond, and installed what they called a modern minimalist landscape. Basically a lot of gravel and those LED light strips that made their yard look like a spacecraft landing pad at night. But here's where it gets interesting, and this is important for understanding why they thought they could get away with building a pool on my property. The Hendersons' lot, while technically larger than mine on paper, has some serious limitations. There's a protected wetland area in their backyard that takes up about 1/3 of their usable space. The previous owners had worked with this natural feature, incorporating it into their Japanese garden design. But the Hendersons, they saw it as an obstacle to their grand plans. They'd spent months trying to get permits to build over the wetland area. I know this because I serve on the county's Environmental Protection Board, something they apparently never bothered to research before moving in. They'd filed appeal after appeal, each one more creative than the last in trying to circumvent environmental regulations. But every single time they were denied. This is where their obsession with my property comes into play. You see, my lot sits slightly higher than theirs, with better drainage and no protected wetland areas. From an engineering perspective, and remember this is literally my field of expertise, my property was actually the ideal location for a pool. The soil composition, the natural grade, the drainage patterns, it was perfect. The only problem, it wasn't their property, but the Hendersons had a history of viewing such minor details as technical obstacles rather than actual barriers. In the 8 months they'd lived here before the pool incident, they'd already racked up an impressive list of violations. They'd installed an unauthorized security system that pointed cameras directly into their neighbors' windows, including mine, built a 6-foot fence in an area restricted to 4-foot fences, and even tried to claim part of the community walking trail as their private driveway extension. Each time they got caught, they'd follow the same playbook. Act surprised, claim ignorance of the rules, and then use their connections on the HOA board to get retroactive approvals. It had worked so well for them in the past that I guess they figured they could apply the same strategy to something as major as a swimming pool. After all, who would dare stand up to the power couple of Willow Creek Estates? Well, they were about to find out, because what they didn't realize was that while they'd been busy planning their illegal pool, I'd been quietly documenting every single one of their violations. Every fake permit, every unauthorized modification, every accidental encroachment on neighboring properties. I had it all meticulously recorded, dated, and filed away. Not because I'm naturally suspicious, mind you, but because 15 years of civil engineering work had taught me the importance of keeping detailed records. Now I need to tell you more about Richard and Sarah Henderson, because understanding who they really are is crucial to appreciating the sheer audacity of what they tried to pull off. On the surface, they were your typical ambitious power couple. Richard, with his perfectly pressed suits and that Harvard law degree he never failed to mention within the first 2 minutes of any conversation. Sarah, with her carefully curated social media presence and what she called her lifestyle brand, basically a series of Instagram posts about living your best suburban life. But beneath that polished exterior lurked something far more calculating. You see, Richard wasn't just any corporate lawyer. He was the kind of lawyer who specialized in finding loopholes. The type who could take a 100-page HOA agreement and somehow interpret it to mean exactly what his clients wanted it to mean. He'd made quite a name for himself in real estate development circles by helping wealthy clients bypass zoning restrictions and building codes through what he called creative legal interpretations. Sarah, meanwhile, was what you might call a social engineer. Before becoming a full-time influencer, she'd worked for a high-end property management company, where she'd learned all about how exclusive communities operate. She knew exactly which strings to pull, which committees to join, and which neighbors to befriend to get what she wanted. Within 3 months of moving in, she'd managed to get herself elected to the HOA board. Within 6 months, she was the board president. But here's what made them truly dangerous as neighbors. They worked as a team. While Sarah was busy hosting her infamous wine and wine sessions, where she'd gather other board members' wives for gossip sessions that mysteriously always led to votes going her way, Richard was quietly rewriting HOA bylaws to give the board, meaning themselves, more power over individual homeowners. I still remember the first time I really understood what we were dealing with. It was during last year's HOA Christmas party, which the Hendersons had insisted on hosting, despite having just moved in. I overheard Richard talking to another neighbor about property values and future development plans. He was explaining in that condescending tone of his how Willow Creek Estates was sadly underutilized and needed to be brought into the modern era. The problem with this place, he'd said, swirling his ridiculously expensive scotch, is that people here think small. They're content with their little gardens and their modest homes. But imagine what this community could be if we just upgraded everything. The way he said upgraded made it clear he wasn't talking about simple improvements. He was talking about a complete transformation. Sarah, meanwhile, had been documenting everything on her social media accounts. She'd branded herself as a community transformation specialist and was using our neighborhood as content for her blog, Suburban Dreams to Luxury Reality. Every minor change they forced through the HOA became a post about elevating your community's standards. Every violation of existing rules was reframed as breaking free from outdated restrictions. But what really set them apart from your typical entitled neighbors was their network. Through Sarah's social media influence and Richard's legal connections, they'd built this web of powerful friends and allies. Local government officials would show up at their dinner parties. Building inspectors would mysteriously find time in their busy schedules whenever the Hendersons needed a permit rushed through. They'd even managed to get several of their friends to buy houses in our community, creating what some of us started calling the Henderson voting block on the HOA board. These weren't just random supporters. They were strategic allies, each one chosen for their specific skills or connections. There was Tom, the real estate developer who'd mysteriously gotten approval for 3 variance requests in a row. Linda, the former city planner who now ran their architectural review committee. and Mike, the contractor who never seemed to need permits for any of his projects. Together, they formed this sort of suburban aristocracy, complete with their own rules, their own social hierarchy, and their own vision for what our community should become. And if that vision happened to trample over other people's property rights or destroy decades-old gardens, well, that was just the price of progress, wasn't it? But here's the thing about people like the Hendersons. They're so used to getting their way that they often overlook the quiet ones. The ones who don't make a fuss at HOA meetings or post their every thought on social media. The ones who just quietly observe, document, and wait for the right moment to act. And in this case, that quiet one happened to be a civil engineer with a deep understanding of water management systems and property law. The first real signs of trouble started about 2 months before the infamous pool incident. I was in my backyard one Saturday morning when I noticed Sarah Henderson and her friend Linda, the former city planner, walking along our shared property line. They had their phones out, taking pictures and measurements, whispering to each other in that conspiratorial way that just screams, "We're up to something." Now, normally, I wouldn't think twice about neighbors walking around their property, but there was something about their behavior that set off my professional alarm bells. See, in my line of work, when people start taking measurements near property lines while trying to look inconspicuous, it usually means they're planning something they shouldn't be. I decided to do what any good engineer would do: document everything. I set up my security cameras to cover that area and started keeping a detailed log of their activities. And boy, am I glad I did, because what happened over the next few weeks was like watching a masterclass in suburban scheming. First came the casual visits. Sarah would show up at my door with her signature green smoothies, which, by the way, tasted like lawn clippings mixed with regret, trying to strike up conversations about yard maintenance and property values. She'd casually mention how much better the neighborhood would look with more water features, and how having a pool nearby could increase my property value by at least 15%. Then came the not-so-subtle hints at HOA meetings. Suddenly, every discussion seemed to revolve around modernizing our community's stance on shared spaces and flexible property line interpretations. Richard would drone on about precedents from other communities where neighbors had successfully collaborated on joint property improvements. Looking back, it was obvious they were laying the groundwork for their pool plan, but at the time, it just seemed like typical Henderson grandstanding. The real red flag came during what I now call the Great Garden Invasion. One morning, I found Sarah and her entire lifestyle blogging crew in my backyard, doing a photo shoot with my hydrangeas as their backdrop. When I confronted them, Sarah had the audacity to say they were documenting the neighborhood's untapped potential. She even had the nerve to suggest that my garden would make a perfect poolside retreat. But here's where it gets really interesting. A few days after the garden invasion, I received an official-looking letter from the HOA, remember, Sarah was the president, about mandatory property reassessment. The letter claimed they needed to evaluate all yards for community improvement opportunities. Basically, they wanted unlimited access to examine my property whenever they wanted. Now, being a civil engineer who deals with property laws and regulations daily, I knew this was complete nonsense. HOAs don't have the authority to demand that kind of access without specific cause. But what really caught my attention was the small print at the bottom of the letter. It mentioned something about homeowners voluntarily ceding certain property rights for community enhancement projects. I took that letter to a friend who specializes in property law, and she nearly spat out her coffee reading it. Turns out, if I had signed and returned that document, I would have essentially given the HOA, meaning the Hendersons, legal permission to use parts of my property for their community improvements. It was basically a very cleverly disguised land grab attempt, but instead of confronting them directly, I decided to play along while documenting everything. I replied to the letter with my own carefully worded response, requesting specific details about these improvement opportunities and asking for copies of all relevant HOA bylaws and legal authorizations. I also casually mentioned my background in civil engineering and my experience with property law. The look on Sarah's face at the next HOA meeting when she realized I wasn't just going to roll over was priceless. She tried to brush it off, claiming there had been a misunderstanding about the letter's intent. Richard jumped in, attempting to smooth things over with his lawyer speak, but I could tell they were rattled. That's when the real psychological warfare began. Suddenly, my property was being cited for the most ridiculous violations. My bird feeders were unauthorized wildlife attractions. My garden hose was improperly coiled. They even tried to claim my hydrangeas were violating some obscure height restriction that didn't actually exist in our bylaws. But what they didn't realize was that each of these petty citations was just adding to my documentation. Every false violation, every manipulated rule, every attempted intimidation tactic went into my growing file of evidence. Because something told me I was going to need it, and soon. Now, to understand why what they did next was not just illegal, but downright dangerous, I need to explain the layout of our properties and why this location was particularly unsuitable for their grandiose pool plans. Remember, I'm a civil engineer, so these details matter. They're not just technical nuances. They're the reason everything went so spectacularly wrong for the Hendersons. Our houses sit on what used to be part of Lake Valley Ridge, one of those upscale developments from the 90s that was built into the natural landscape rather than just bulldozing everything flat. The terrain here has a natural slope that runs from east to west, with about a 15-foot elevation change from my back property line to the Hendersons' front yard. This slope isn't just for show. It's part of the area's natural watershed management system. My property sits at the higher end of this slope, which is why my award-winning hydrangeas did so well. Perfect drainage, just the right amount of morning, sun and soil that's essentially geological gold for gardening. The previous owners had worked with an environmental engineer, ironically, someone I'd worked with on several projects, to design a sustainable landscape that worked with the natural water flow rather than against it. The Hendersons' property, on the other hand, sits lower and includes that protected wetland area I mentioned earlier. Their lot is what we in the engineering world call a hydrological nexus point. Basically, it's where several natural water flows converge. This is why the previous owners had installed that beautiful koi pond. It wasn't just decorative, it was part of the property's water management system. But here's the crucial part that the Hendersons either didn't understand or chose to ignore. Between our properties runs what we call a natural swale. Think of it as Mother Nature's drainage ditch. During heavy rains, this swale channels water from the higher elevations, my property and others, down toward the wetland area, preventing flooding and maintaining the ecological balance of the entire neighborhood. When the Hendersons ripped out all the original landscaping, they disrupted this natural flow pattern. Their modern minimalist landscape, which basically meant covering everything with impermeable hardscaping, was already causing minor drainage issues during regular rainstorms. But what they were planning with this pool would turn a manageable problem into an environmental disaster waiting to happen. The property line between our lots isn't just a simple straight line either. It follows what property surveyors call a topographical boundary, meaning it was drawn to respect the natural features of the land. This is why my garden beds seem to curve slightly at the southern edge. They're following the natural contour of the hill. I had detailed surveys of Both properties because I'd done some work with the previous owners of the Hendersons lot on a joint rain garden project. These surveys showed exactly where the water table sat, where the natural drainage patterns ran, and most importantly, where you absolutely should not dig a large hole and fill it with thousands of gallons of water. The spot where they were planning to put their pool. It was literally the worst possible location from an engineering standpoint. Not only would it disrupt the natural swale, but it would also create what we call a hydrostatic pressure point. Imagine trying to hold a water balloon in place underwater. The pressure would constantly be trying to push the pool up and out, especially during heavy rains. But what made this situation even more precarious was the soil composition. Below the topsoil, we have what's called stratified clay layers, basically sheets of clay that can become extremely slippery when wet. Think of it like trying to build a pool on top of stacked wet paper towels. Any significant water pressure could cause the whole thing to shift. I had all of this documented in detailed geological surveys and water table maps. In fact, these were the same documents I'd used years ago to help the previous owners design their drainage systems. The Hendersons would have had access to these reports too. They're part of the property records that come with any home purchase in our area. But apparently they were too busy planning their luxury oasis to bother reading boring things like environmental impact studies and geological surveys. The irony is, there was actually a perfect spot for a pool on their property. The higher ground near their garage, well away from the wetland area and natural drainage patterns. But that location wouldn't have given them the resort-style views they wanted. And more importantly, it wouldn't have encroached on my property, which seemed to be a key part of their plan. The first direct confrontation happened exactly 3 weeks before the pool incident, and it started with something that seemed relatively minor at the time. I was working from home that day when I heard what sounded like heavy machinery near my property line. Looking out my home office window, I saw a small bobcat excavator parked right next to my prized hydrangea beds, with none other than Mike, remember him? The contractor from their voting block, at the controls. They weren't actually digging yet. Instead, they were doing what looked like preliminary site marking. Richard Henderson was there too, dressed in what I can only describe as his idea of construction casual, pressed khakis and a polo shirt that probably cost more than the excavator rental. He was holding what appeared to be construction plans, gesturing enthusiastically while Mike nodded along. Now, as a civil engineer, I know exactly what preliminary site work looks like. And this wasn't it. For one thing, they didn't have any survey equipment set up. No transit levels, no grade stakes, not even a simple laser level. They were literally measuring with a tape measure and marking spots with spray paint, the kind of amateur approach that makes professional engineers wake up in cold sweats. Decided to do what any reasonable neighbor would do, I walked outside to ask what they were planning. The conversation that followed was like a masterclass in passive-aggressive neighborly interaction. "Oh, hello," Richard called out, trying to casually fold up the plans he was holding. "We're just doing some routine yard maintenance, with an excavator next to my property line." "Right." "Really?" I responded, making sure my security cameras were recording. "Because it looks like you're planning some kind of construction project." That's when Sarah appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, clutching her ever-present phone and wearing what looked like a designer version of a construction vest. "We're just exploring some options for community enhancement," she said, already recording for what I assumed would be her next Instagram story. "You should be excited. This will definitely increase your property value." I decided to play dumb, a strategy that had served me well in dealing with the Hendersons so far. "Oh, what kind of enhancement?" I asked innocently. "Because any construction this close to the property line would need proper permits and surveys, not to mention HOA approval." Sarah's smile flickered for just a moment. Well, as HOA president, I can assure you that won't be a problem. And Mike here has all the necessary paperwork. Mike, to his credit, looked uncomfortable. He kept glancing between the Hendersons and me, like he was watching a tennis match where both players were using live grenades instead of balls. Great, I said, pulling out my phone. Then you won't mind if I take pictures of the permits and surveys for my records. As a civil engineer, I'm always interested in local construction projects. That's when Richard stepped in, lawyer mode fully activated. Actually, we're still in the preliminary planning phase, but rest assured everything will be fully compliant with all applicable regulations. The way he said applicable regulations made it clear he was already thinking about ways to bend them. But what really caught my attention was the corner of the construction plan sticking out of his folder. I could just make out what looked like a pool outline, and it definitely extended onto my property. You know, I said, still maintaining my innocent act. The soil composition in this area is really interesting. Lots of stratified clay layers makes it tricky for certain types of construction. I actually have some detailed geological surveys from when— Yes, that's fascinating, Sarah interrupted, already losing interest. But we really must get back to our planning. Don't worry, this will all be handled very professionally. As they hurriedly packed up their equipment and left, I noticed they'd left behind some of their spray paint markings. Looking at them more closely, I realized they'd marked out a rough rectangle that extended at least 6 feet onto my property. That's when I knew this wasn't just going to be a simple boundary dispute. This was going to be war. The next morning, I woke up at 6 a.m. to the sound of multiple construction vehicles rumbling down our street. This wasn't just a single excavator anymore. They had brought in serious, heavy equipment. A full-sized backhoe, 2 dump trucks, and what looked like materials for pool construction were all lined up along the Hendersons' driveway. But what really caught my attention was the pool company's name on the trucks, Luxury Pools Unlimited, where permits are our problem. I'd heard about this company before, and not in a good way. They were known for rushing jobs, cutting corners, and somehow managing to get permits approved in record time. One of my colleagues in the civil engineering department had actually written a report about their questionable construction practices, but nothing ever came of it thanks to their apparent connections at City Hall. I grabbed my phone and started recording, making sure to capture the equipment positions and the timestamps. That's when I saw Sarah Henderson practically bouncing down her driveway, phone in hand, already live-streaming to her followers. "Good morning, suburban paradise warriors," she chirped into her phone. "Today's the day we start transforming this boring backyard into the ultimate luxury oasis. And the best part? Our pool is going to be the biggest in the neighborhood. We're talking resort-style luxury." I noticed she carefully avoided mentioning exactly how they were planning to make their pool the biggest, but I already knew. Those spray paint marks from yesterday told the whole story. They were planning to extend the pool at least 6 feet onto my property. Just then, Richard emerged from their garage, carrying what looked like official documents. He was wearing a hard hat that still had the price tag on it and carrying his signature leather briefcase. The contrast was almost comical, like someone playing dress-up as a construction manager. "All the paperwork is in order," he announced, loudly, clearly putting on a show for any neighbors who might be watching. "We have all the necessary approvals and permits to begin construction immediately." Now, I've dealt with enough construction permits in my career to know that getting pool permits approved typically takes weeks, if not months. The fact that they supposedly had everything ready to go overnight sent up major red flags. I walked over to my property line, coffee cup in hand, and called out in my most neighborly voice, "Good morning! Those permits must have been processed in record time. Mind if I take a look? Just professional curiosity, you know." Richard's face did that thing where it tries to smile and grimace at the same time. Oh, there's no need for that. Everything's been properly filed with the city. We wouldn't want to bore you with all the technical details. Actually, I replied, as a civil engineer, I find technical details fascinating, especially when they involve construction so close to my property line. That's when Mike the contractor stepped in, looking increasingly uncomfortable. We should really get started, he muttered. The concrete truck is scheduled for later today. Sarah was still live streaming, but I noticed she had positioned herself so that my property wasn't visible in her shot. Our wonderful contractor is ready to begin creating our dream pool. Don't forget to like and subscribe to see the full transformation. The workers were already starting to move equipment into position, and I could see them referring to those construction plans, the same ones Richard had tried to hide yesterday. One of the workers, looking confused, was measuring the distance to my property line and having what appeared to be a heated discussion with Mike. I decided it was time to play my first card. Before you start digging, I called out, you might want to check the geological survey reports for this area. There's some interesting subsurface drainage patterns that could affect pool placement. Richard waved his hand dismissively. Our contractors know what they're doing. This isn't our first pool installation. No, I agreed, but it might be your first pool installation over a natural swale with stratified clay layers and a high water table. Those surveys show some pretty significant hydrostatic pressure issues in this exact spot. The workers paused, looking uncertainly between me and the Hendersons. Sarah's live-stream smile faltered for just a moment. Richard's face had turned an interesting shade of red. Perhaps, he said through gritted teeth, we could discuss any concerns you have privately, rather than disrupting our construction schedule. Oh, I'd be happy to discuss it, I replied, pulling out my phone. In fact, I've got the geological surveys right here. Should we invite the building inspector to join the conversation? I'm sure they'd be very interested in these plans. That's when everything went from bad to worse. Instead of backing down or even attempting to have a reasonable discussion, Sarah and Richard decided to play what they thought was their trump card. Sarah ended her live stream abruptly, and Richard pulled out another set of documents from his briefcase with a flourish that would have made a magician proud. Actually, Richard announced with that smug lawyer smile of his, we have something that might interest you. He handed me what appeared to be an official-looking document with the HOA letterhead. This is a copy of the new HOA bylaw amendment that was passed last month. Section 7, paragraph 3, specifically addresses community enhancement projects and shared property utilization. I started reading the document, and I have to tell you, it was a masterpiece of legal manipulation. Buried in pages of deliberately confusing language was a clause that essentially gave the HOA board, which remember was controlled by the Hendersons and their friends, the right to reallocate property boundaries for community enhancement projects, with only board approval. No homeowner consent required. As you can see, Sarah chimed in, barely containing her glee. This is all completely legal. The board voted unanimously to approve our pool project as a community enhancement. You should be thanking us. This will increase everyone's property values. That's when I noticed something that made me almost choke on my coffee. The document had yesterday's date on it, but they were claiming it was passed last month. They hadn't even bothered to backdate it properly. It was such an obvious forgery that I almost laughed out loud. Instead, I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures of everything. The document, the construction equipment positions, the spray paint marks on my property, all of it. Interesting timing on that amendment, I said casually. Especially since I have a recording of last month's HOA meeting where no such amendment was discussed or voted on. Richard's smug smile flickered for just a moment. That meeting was preliminary. The actual vote was conducted via email. Really? I replied, still taking pictures. Because according to our HOA charter, which I have right here on my phone, bylaw amendments require an in-person vote with at least 75% of homeowners present. Also, they need to be filed with the county clerk's office at least 30 days before taking effect. Should we call them to verify when this was filed? The construction workers had stopped what they were doing and were openly watching our exchange. Now, Mike the contractor was looking increasingly nervous, probably realizing he might be getting pulled into something illegal. But the Hendersons weren't done yet. Sarah pulled out her ultimate weapon, her social media influence. She started, recording again, but this time aimed at me. I'm so sad to share this, but one of our neighbors is trying to stop a wonderful community improvement project because of their selfish NIMBY attitude. This is exactly what's wrong with suburban development. Richard joined in, his lawyer mode, in full swing. Any attempts to obstruct this project could be seen as tortious interference with a legitimate business operation. We'd hate to have to pursue legal action against a neighbor. That's when I decided to play my ace. Speaking of legal action, I said, pulling up some images on my phone, would anyone like to explain why these construction permits have yesterday's date but somehow show approval stamps from 3 different departments? Especially since I know for a fact that the building permit office has been closed for the past week for system upgrades. The silence that followed was deafening. The construction workers started muttering among themselves. Mike the contractor suddenly remembered he had an urgent appointment elsewhere. Sarah's phone slowly lowered as the implications sank in. But Richard, ever the lawyer, tried one last gambit. Those permits are perfectly legitimate. They were expedited through proper channels. Interesting, I replied. I'm sure the city's ethics board would love to hear about these proper channels, along with the county prosecutor's office, since forging building permits is a felony in our state. But the Hendersons, true to their nature, decided to double down on their plan instead of backing off. Richard pulled Mike the contractor aside for what looked like an intense discussion, while Sarah started making frantic phone calls. I could hear snippets of her conversation, something about emergency approvals and calling in favors. That's when things took a truly surreal turn. Instead of stopping the construction, they actually accelerated it. Richard came marching back, phone in hand, speaking loudly enough to make sure I could hear, "Yes, Judge Thompson, I understand completely. Thank you for your quick response to this situation. We'll proceed as discussed." He then turned to me with a triumphant smirk. "I've just spoken with Judge Thompson, who happens to be a personal friend. He's assured me that any attempts to interfere with this construction could result in immediate legal consequences. So unless you want to face a lawsuit for harassment and obstruction, I suggest you go back inside and let the professionals work." Now, I'm no lawyer, but I'm pretty sure judges don't typically make impromptu legal rulings over the phone about property disputes. Also, I happen to know that Judge Thompson was actually on vacation in Europe. My sister works at the courthouse and had just processed his leave paperwork last week. But before I could point this out, the construction crew sprang into action. It was like watching a choreographed dance. Excavators revving up, workers rushing around with measuring tapes, and concrete trucks suddenly appearing at the end of our street. Sarah was back to live streaming, now painting a narrative about overcoming obstacles and persistent vision in the face of negativity. "Isn't it amazing how the universe tests us?" she chirped to her phone. "But nothing can stop us from creating our dream backyard oasis. Swipe up for my guide on handling difficult neighbors." I decided it was time to document everything in detail. I set up my tripod and started recording with my professional camera, the one I usually use for engineering site surveys. I also called my friend at the city planning office, putting the call on speaker so everyone could hear. "Hey, Jim. Yeah, it's me. Quick question. Has the building permit system come back online after the upgrade?" "No. Still down until next week." How interesting. So there's no way any new permits could have been issued yesterday, right? Especially not pool construction permits? That's what I thought. The construction crew was starting to look really uncomfortable now. A few of them were quietly packing up their tools, clearly wanting no part of what was obviously becoming a legal mess. But Richard and Sarah were beyond caring about appearances. "Start digging," Richard commanded, his face now an interesting shade of purple. "Anyone who leaves the site won't be paid." That's when I played my next card. "Before you start digging," I called out to the crew, "you might want to know that I've already contacted the city's emergency utility hotline. They've confirmed that there are unmarked gas and water lines running through this exact area. Digging without proper clearance would be a major safety violation." This wasn't actually true. I knew exactly where all the utility lines were, and they were nowhere near the proposed pool site. But I also knew that no construction worker in their right mind would risk hitting a gas line. The crew immediately stopped what they were doing. Safety violations weren't just about fines, they could mean jail time. Sarah's live stream abruptly ended as she realized things were spiraling out of control. But Richard wasn't giving up. He stormed over to the excavator himself, apparently, deciding that if you want something done illegally, you have to do it yourself. "I'll show you how ridiculous this all is," he shouted, climbing into the cab. Now, watching a corporate lawyer who'd probably never operated anything more complicated than a stapler try to manage a piece of heavy machinery would have been hilarious under other circumstances. But as he awkwardly jerked the controls, swinging the excavator's arm dangerously close to my hydrangea beds, I realized this had gone far enough. And that's when Mother Nature decided to join the party. Remember those stratified clay layers and drainage patterns I mentioned earlier? Well, as if on cue, dark clouds started rolling in. Not just any rain clouds. We're talking about those ominous charcoal grey monsters that typically precede a major storm. The local weather alert system started blasting warnings to everyone's phones simultaneously. Severe storm warning, flash flood potential, seek shelter immediately. The construction crew didn't need any more convincing. They started packing up their equipment at record speed. But Richard, still in the excavator and apparently believing he was now a qualified heavy machinery operator, had managed to dig a sizable hole right on our property line. It wasn't quite pool-sized yet, but it was definitely big enough to cause problems. And Sarah, she was back to live streaming, trying to spin this impending disaster as content gold. "This is so exciting." And she squealed into her phone. "We're racing against Mother Nature to create our dream pool. Don't forget to like and subscribe to see if we make it." I tried one last time to reason with them. "That hole is going to collect water like a basin. The entire slope's drainage is going to funnel right into it. You need to at least put up some erosion barriers before the storm hits." "Oh, please," Richard scoffed, finally climbing down from the excavator. "I think we know a little more about property development than you do. This is going to be fine." That's when the first massive raindrops started falling. Not a gentle spring shower, but those huge, heavy drops that feel like nature's warning shots. The wind picked up dramatically, and I could hear emergency alert sirens in the distance. Sarah was still trying to maintain her influencer composure. "This is just adding drama to our pool story. Think of how amazing the before and after videos will be." The construction crew had completely abandoned ship by this point, leaving behind only their heavy equipment and some hastily placed tarps that were already starting to blow away in the increasing wind. The hole Richard had dug was starting to fill with water at an alarming rate. Then came the thunder, not the distant rumbling kind, but the crack-boom type that makes your windows rattle. The rain wasn't just falling anymore. It was like someone had turned on a giant pressure washer in the sky. I quickly set up my weather station equipment. Yes, I have a professional weather station. Engineering habits die hard, and started recording the rainfall rates. In less than 15 minutes, we'd already received over 2 inches of rain. The water was flowing exactly as I'd predicted, right down the natural swale, directly into Richard's amateur excavation project. The hole was filling up fast, but that wasn't even the biggest problem. The water was starting to undermine the soil around the edges of the excavation. I could see small rivulets forming as the rain found its way between those clay layers I'd warned them about. Sarah had finally stopped live streaming and was staring in horror as her designer rain boots slowly sank into the increasingly muddy ground. Richard was frantically making phone calls, probably trying to reach his contractor friends who had conveniently disappeared. "We need to do something." Sarah screamed over the storm, her perfectly styled hair now plastered to her face. "Can't you help us? I was already pulling out my emergency drainage equipment. Yes, I keep that kind of thing on hand." "I tried to help you," I shouted back. "I tried to tell you about the drainage patterns and the soil composition, but you just had to have your pool exactly where you wanted it, didn't you?" That's when we heard it. A sound that made everyone freeze. It was a deep, gurgling noise, followed by what can only be described as the earth sighing. The ground around the excavation was starting to shift. The next few minutes were pure chaos. The illegal excavation had created exactly the kind of hydrostatic pressure point I'd warned them about. The water wasn't just filling the hole anymore, it was actively pushing up through the clay layers, creating what we engineers call a soil liquefaction event. In normal terms, the ground was turning into quicksand. The excavator, which Richard had left perilously close to the edge of the hole, started to lean. Not quickly, but with that slow, inevitable movement that tells you something really bad is about to happen. The rain was coming down so hard now that it was creating sheets of water flowing down our properties, my landscaping. Sarah screamed, watching as her expensive minimalist gravel garden turned into what looked like a rock-filled water slide. All those LED lights they'd installed were shorting out, sending sparks into the air like some kind of demented light show. But that was just the opening act. The main event started when the excavator finally lost its battle with gravity. With a sound like a giant metal whale doing a belly flop, it slid sideways into the rapidly expanding hole. The impact sent a wave of muddy water shooting up like a geyser, drenching everyone within range. Richard, finally realizing the severity of the situation, started running around like a headless chicken, alternating between trying to call his lawyer friends and yelling at the storm as if it was personally offending him. "This isn't supposed to happen," he kept shouting. "Do you know how much that equipment rental cost?" I was already implementing my emergency drainage protocol, something I'd actually designed years ago for exactly this type of situation. But as I was setting up my emergency pumps, I heard another ominous sound, the distinct crack of wood splitting. Remember that expensive cedar fence they'd installed without permits last summer? Well, it turns out that when you don't properly anchor your fence posts and then add rushing water to the equation, physics tends to have the last laugh. The entire fence line started to fold like a row of dominoes. "My social media reputation is ruined," Sarah wailed, still trying to film the disaster with her increasingly wet phone. "How am I supposed to spin this to my followers?" That's when things went from disastrous to biblical. The pressure from the water had found a weak point in the clay layers, and suddenly we had what amounted to an underground river running through our yards. The hole Richard had dug was now expanding on its own, eating away at both our properties like some kind of hungry earth monster. The Hendersons' prized outdoor kitchen, the one they'd installed without proper foundation, work started sliding downhill as the ground beneath it gave way. The built-in grill, the marble countertops, the wine fridge, all of it was moving like it was on some sort of demented conveyor belt. "Do something!" Richard screamed at me, as if I could somehow reverse the laws of physics and geology that he'd so confidently ignored. "I am doing something," I shouted back over the storm. "I'm documenting everything for the insurance companies and the city investigators. And before you even think about suing me, remember that I have footage of you operating construction equipment without a license." The crisis reached its peak when their precious LED light strips finally shorted out completely, sending up a shower of sparks that briefly illuminated the whole scene like some kind of apocalyptic photo shoot. There we were, standing in the pouring rain, watching as thousands of dollars of illegal construction work turned into what was essentially the world's most expensive mud bath. And through it all, my security cameras were capturing every moment. Every bad decision, every ignored warning, every bit of karma coming back to bite them, all of it recorded in glorious high definition. Because if there's one thing you learn as an engineer, it's that documentation is everything. By the time the storm finally passed, about 3 hours later, the full extent of the damage was becoming clear, and it was worse than even I had predicted. The Hendersons' yard looked like someone had tried to create a water park in a mud pit. The excavator was now sitting at a 45-degree angle in what had become a small lake, its bright yellow paint covered in mud and looking more like a modern art installation than construction equipment. But that was just the beginning of their problems. Remember that fancy outdoor kitchen that had started sliding? Well, it had completed its journey, all right, right into their neighbor's yard on the other side. Linda, you know, the former city planner who was part of their voting bloc, was standing on her back deck, mouth agape, staring at the half-buried grill and marble countertops that had taken up residence in her prized petunia beds. The damage to my property was significant, but thankfully contained mostly to the area where my hydrangea beds had been. I'd managed to save about half of them by quickly implementing emergency drainage measures when the storm started. The other half, though, they were now part of what geologists would probably study as an example of rapid terrain reformation. Sarah was sitting on their back patio, or what was left of it, mascara running down her face, trying to figure out how to spin this disaster to her followers. I could hear her practicing different voices. When life gives you mudslides, no, that's not it. Ultimate backyard transformation gone. No, can't say that either. Richard, meanwhile, was on his phone having what appeared to be several increasingly heated conversations with various people. From the bits I could overhear, the rental company wasn't too happy about their excavator's new home in our impromptu pond. His insurance company was asking some very uncomfortable questions about permits, and his lawyer friends were suddenly not taking his calls. The real kicker came when we heard sirens approaching. Apparently, someone, definitely not me, had called the city's emergency response team about a possible hazardous construction site. Within minutes, our quiet street was filled with emergency vehicles, city inspectors, and environmental assessment teams. The look on the chief building inspector's face as he surveyed the scene was priceless. He kept looking from the muddy disaster to his clipboard and back again, like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "Would someone like to explain?" he asked in that special tone reserved for people who've seen it all. "Why there's an excavator in an unpermitted excavation that appears to be turning into a sinkhole?" Sarah tried to jump in with her influencer charm. "We're just doing some minor landscaping improvements." "Minor landscaping improvements?" The inspector cut her off. "Ma'am, you've got enough violations here to fill my quota for the entire year." That's when the environmental assessment team started taking soil samples and water readings. Their equipment was picking up some interesting chemical signatures from all the landscaping materials and construction debris that had been washed into the ground. Turns out those luxury materials the Hendersons had used weren't exactly environmentally friendly. The coup de grace came when the city's geological survey team arrived. They took one look at the site and immediately called for additional backup. Apparently, our little disaster had exposed some previously unknown underground water channels, and they were concerned about potential impacts on the entire neighborhood's foundation stability. Through it all, my weather station and security cameras had been diligently recording everything, every measurement, every moment, every failed attempt by the Hendersons to talk their way out of this situation, all of it documented in precise, time-stamped detail. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't something you plan, it's just letting nature take its course, while making sure you've got really good insurance and really good documentation. The next morning brought a level of activity to our quiet street that made the previous day's chaos look like a casual get-together. City officials, insurance adjusters, environmental inspectors, and a team from the county prosecutor's office had all descended on our properties. The Hendersons' dream of a luxury pool had turned into a nightmare of legal and regulatory proportions. I decided it was time to unleash my full documentation arsenal. First, I submitted a comprehensive report to the City Planning Commission, complete with time-stamped photos, videos, and detailed geological surveys, showing exactly why the Hendersons pool project was doomed from the start. I included everything: the fake permits, the forged HOA documents, even screenshots of Sarah's live streams where she basically admitted to knowing they were building on my property. But I didn't stop there. Remember those weather station readings I'd been collecting? Turns out they were exactly what the environmental assessment team needed to understand the full impact of the drainage disruption. I provided them with detailed data showing how the Hendersons' illegal construction had effectively created a new watershed pattern that threatened not just our properties, but potentially the entire neighborhood's stability. This is remarkably thorough, the lead environmental inspector said, flipping through my report. Most homeowners don't maintain professional-grade weather stations and soil composition records. Most homeowners aren't civil engineers who specialize in water management. Systems, I replied, watching Richard's face turn an interesting shade of green as he realized just who he'd been dealing with. The city's legal team was particularly interested in my security camera footage, especially the part where Richard, in his infinite wisdom, had decided to operate heavy machinery without a license. The prosecutor actually had to pause the video several times because she was trying not to laugh at his attempts to work the excavator controls. "Let me get this straight," she said, reviewing her notes. "They built on your property without permission, used forged permits, violated multiple environmental regulations, and then Mr. Henderson operated construction equipment without a license or training, all while his wife live-streamed the entire thing?" Sarah, who had been unusually quiet all morning, suddenly perked up. "The live stream got amazing engagement numbers, though," she offered helpfully before her personal attorney practically tackled her to stop her from talking. "I also filed formal complaints with every relevant regulatory body I could think of: the Building Department, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Contractors Licensing Board, even the State Bar Association." Richard's creative interpretation of property law had definitely caught their attention. But my masterstroke came when I presented evidence of the Hendersons' HOA manipulation. Remember all those suspicious board votes and mysterious bylaw changes? I had been keeping detailed records of every meeting, every vote, and every irregularity. When I laid it all out for the HOA's legal counsel, complete with spreadsheets, meeting minutes, and audio recordings, they practically sprinted to distance themselves from the Hendersons. I've never seen such a comprehensive documentation of HOA violations, the HOA's lawyer admitted, looking both impressed and slightly terrified. "Did you really create a database to track voting patterns and bylaw changes?" "The spreadsheets are an engineer's best friend," I replied, pulling up even more charts and graphs. "Would you like to see the statistical analysis of their violation enforcement patterns? I've included a heat map." Meanwhile, the Hendersons were trying to mount their own defense, but it wasn't going well. Richard's attempts to legally justify their actions were falling apart faster than their backyard, and Sarah's social media influence wasn't quite as effective with the city prosecutors as it had been with her followers. The initial consequences of my documentation blitz hit the Hendersons like a tsunami of bureaucratic justice. Within 48 hours, they had received cease and desist orders from 6 different city departments, 3 environmental agencies, and the State Contractors Board. Their luxury oasis dream had officially turned into a regulatory nightmare. First came the fines, and oh boy, were there fines. The building department alone hit them with penalties that made their designer landscaping budget look like pocket change. Every day, the excavator remained in our impromptu pond, now officially classified as an unauthorized water feature by the city, added another hefty fine to their growing tab. "But we can't remove it yet," Richard protested during an emergency HOA meeting. "The ground is still too unstable. Perhaps you should have thought about ground stability before operating construction equipment without a license," the HOA's lawyer replied dryly, clearly enjoying this more than was professionally necessary. The HOA board, seeing which way the wind was blowing, suddenly developed collective amnesia about all those mysterious bylaw changes they'd approved. Sarah's former allies couldn't distance themselves fast enough. Linda, the former city planner, actually tried to claim she'd been deep undercover, investigating the Hendersons' violations all along. "I knew something wasn't right," Linda insisted, conveniently forgetting her role in approving their illegal fence. "I was just gathering evidence." The contractor's licensing board was particularly interested in Mike's role in all this. Turned out our friendly neighborhood contractor had been operating under a license that was about as legitimate as the Hendersons' pool permits. He'd disappeared faster than their property values, but not before the board had opened a formal investigation. Sarah's attempts to control the narrative on social media backfired spectacularly. Her followers, who had been eagerly watching her luxury transformation content, were now treated to daily updates from other neighbors documenting the disaster. Henderson hole and pool apocalypse started trending locally, much to her horror. "This isn't the kind of engagement I wanted," she wailed during a particularly tense neighborhood meeting. "My influence marketing contracts are being cancelled." But the real hammer fell when the Environmental Protection Agency released their initial findings. Those fancy imported materials the Hendersons had used in their landscaping turned out some of them were banned in residential areas due to their chemical composition. The EPA representative actually had to put on protective gear just to take soil samples. "Congratulations," the EPA inspector told them sarcastically. "You've managed to create what we're classifying as a minor environmental disaster zone in your backyard. We don't usually see this level of contamination outside of industrial sites." The city's geological survey team wasn't any more comforting. Their report included phrases like compromised soil stability and potential sinkhole formation, words that make both insurance adjusters and homeowners break out in cold sweats. "Based on our preliminary findings," the lead geologist announced, "this area will need extensive remediation work. And when I say extensive, I mean you'll be lucky if this costs less than your house is worth." The Hendersons Insurance Company, after reviewing my meticulously documented evidence, sent them a letter that basically amounted to, "You're on your own." Apparently, intentionally ignoring basic engineering principles while conducting illegal construction wasn't covered under their policy. Even their fancy lawyer friends started backing away. It's amazing how quickly "I know some judges" turns into "please don't mention my name in court" when faced with actual legal consequences. The legal resolution that followed was both swift and spectacular. The city prosecutor's office, armed with my mountain of evidence, decided to make an example of the Hendersons. They scheduled what was supposed to be a routine hearing about building code violations. It turned into what the local paper called the Great Pool Permit Scandal of 2024. The hearing room was packed. Apparently news of rich homeowners getting their comeuppance draws quite a crowd. Sarah tried to turn it into another social media opportunity, but was quickly shut down when the judge threatened to hold her in contempt if she didn't stop live streaming the proceedings. Richard, thinking he could lawyer his way out of this, decided to represent himself. Big mistake, huge. The conversation went something like this. "Your Honor," Richard began, straightening his designer tie, "this is clearly a simple misunderstanding about property boundaries and permit timing. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who'd clearly seen it all, peered over her glasses. "Mr. Henderson, are you suggesting that forging building permits, operating heavy machinery without a license, and creating an environmental hazard zone was all a simple misunderstanding?" "Well, when you put it that way," Richard stammered, his legal bravado evaporating. The prosecutor methodically went through my evidence, displaying my time-stamped photos and videos on the courtroom's big screen. The footage of Richard operating the excavator got an actual laugh from the gallery. But the real knockout came when they played Sarah's live stream clips, where she essentially narrated their illegal activities in real time. "And here we are, ignoring all these boring property lines," past Sarah chirped from the screen. Present Sarah sank lower in her seat. The judge's ruling was comprehensive. The Hendersons were ordered to pay for complete environmental remediation of both properties, remove the excavator, which by now had become something of a local landmark, restore my hydrangea beds to their original condition, cover all costs for stabilizing the affected soil, pay substantial fines to every regulatory agency involved. But the judge wasn't done. She also ordered them to take a property law class and a basic construction safety course. "Perhaps," she noted dryly, "this will help you understand why we have building codes in the first place." The HOA board, in a separate hearing, voted to remove Sarah as president and invalidate all the suspicious bylaw changes. They also implemented new rules specifically prohibiting unauthorized excavation and social media-driven construction projects. Yes, those exact phrases are now in our HOA guidelines. The State Bar Association launched their own investigation into Richard's creative legal interpretations. Turns out, trying to use fake judge phone calls as evidence isn't looked upon favorably by the legal community. Who knew? The contractor's licensing board revoked Mike's license and fined him so heavily that he had to sell his pool guy vanity license plate. Linda resigned from the Architectural Review Committee, claiming she needed to spend more time with her petunias. But my favorite part of the resolution: the judge ordered the Hendersons to install a permanent marker at the site of their failed pool project, detailing the importance of proper permits and respect for property rights. It's become quite the conversation piece during neighborhood walks. The months following the legal resolution brought some interesting changes to our neighborhood. The Hendersons, facing astronomical fines and restoration costs, had to make some dramatic lifestyle adjustments. Their dream of becoming the neighborhood's social elite had quite literally sunk into the mud. First came the remediation work. Professional environmental teams in hazmat suits became a regular sight in our yards. They brought in specialized equipment to remove the contaminated soil and stabilize the ground. The process was slow, methodical, and extremely expensive. Exactly the kind of thing that proper permits and planning would have prevented. Sarah's social media empire took an unexpected turn. Instead of posting about luxury home improvements, she was now documenting what she called her journey to regulatory compliance. Her followers actually increased, though probably not for the reasons she'd hoped. People love watching a good redemption story, especially when it involves karma. Today's tip: she'd post, standing next to the warning marker the judge had ordered. Always check property lines before digging. Lessons learned. Pool fail. Permits are important. Richard, humbled by his legal misadventures and facing an ethics review from the state bar, became surprisingly interested in actual property law. He even started attending city council meetings. As an observer this time, not a manipulator, I spotted him taking actual notes during discussions about zoning regulations. The excavator removal became something of a local event. They had to bring in a specialized crane and a team of engineers, not me, thankfully, to figure out how to extract it without causing further damage. The local news covered it live, and someone even made T-shirts with "I survived the great pool extraction" of 2024 printed on them. But the real transformation came in how the neighborhood dynamic changed. The Hendersons' former allies in the HOA suddenly became enthusiastic supporters of transparency and proper procedures. Amazing how a few $100,000 in fines can adjust people's attitudes about following rules. Linda, still trying to salvage her reputation, started a neighborhood garden club focused on responsible landscaping practices. She asked me to give a presentation about soil composition and drainage patterns. I agreed, but only after she helped replant my hydrangea beds. The HOA underwent its own transformation. The new board, notably Henderson-free, implemented a series of reforms that actually made sense. They created a transparent process for construction approvals, required professional surveys for any major projects, and established what they called the Henderson rule. No construction permits could be approved via social media influence. As for my property, the restoration work actually gave me an opportunity to improve things. With the settlement money, I was able to install a proper drainage system and expand my garden. My hydrangeas, replanted with expert care, were thriving better than ever. But the most satisfying outcome? I finally built that water feature I'd been planning for years, a small, perfectly legal, professionally installed fountain that just happened to be visible from the Hendersons' back patio. Every permit was properly filed, every regulation followed, and every step documented. Sarah would sometimes stand at her window, watching the water flow in my perfectly designed fountain, probably remembering her dreams of a resort-style pool. Richard would occasionally pause during his morning coffee, staring at the warning marker in their yard, likely contemplating the difference between actual property law and his creative interpretations of it. The excavator company, having learned their lesson about checking permits, now requires clients to show proof of proper documentation before delivering any equipment. They've even started using photos of the Henderson incident in their training materials as an example of what not to do. And that hole that started all this? It's now a properly engineered rain garden, designed to work with the natural drainage patterns instead of against them. The environmental team actually uses it as a case study in successful land restoration. Every spring, when my hydrangeas bloom around it, I think about how sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even. It's about doing things right. Looking back at this whole incident, it's amazing how a simple desire for a backyard pool turned into such a perfect storm of entitlement, ignorance, and consequences. But there are some really important lessons that came out of this whole disaster, and I think they're worth sharing. First and foremost, this story really shows how dangerous it can be when people think rules don't apply to them. The Hendersons weren't bad people. Not really. They were just so caught up in their vision of what they wanted that they completely lost sight of reality. They thought their social connections and Richard's legal knowledge would let them bypass the basic laws of both property rights and physics. Spoiler alert, neither of those things can be overruled by Instagram followers. The whole situation reminds me of something my first engineering professor used to say: nature doesn't care about your plans. You can have all the money in the world, all the social media influence, all the fancy lawyers, but at the end of the day, water will flow downhill, soil will respond to pressure, and gravity will always win. The Hendersons learned this lesson the hard way, quite literally watching their dreams sink into the mud. But there's also a deeper lesson here about community and responsibility. The Hendersons saw our neighborhood as something they could reshape, according to their vision, without any regard for the people who already lived here or the natural environment they were disrupting. They treated their neighbors' properties as obstacles to be overcome, rather than boundaries to be respected. This kind of attitude, this belief that personal desire trumps community well-being, seems to be growing more common these days. People get so focused on creating their perfect Instagram moment that they forget about the real-world implications of their actions. They don't think about how their choices affect their neighbors, their environment, or even their own safety. The irony is, if the Hendersons had just followed the proper procedures and respected the property lines, they probably could have built a perfectly nice pool in their yard. Maybe not the enormous resort-style monstrosity they wanted, but something practical and enjoyable. Instead, their determination to have exactly what they wanted, exactly where they wanted it, cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars and their reputation in the community. There's also something to be said here about the power of documentation and patience. I didn't need to confront them aggressively or start a neighborhood feud. I just needed to carefully document everything and let the proper authorities do their jobs. Sometimes the best response to someone else's chaos is to stay calm and keep detailed records. The environmental impact of their actions is particularly worth noting. They thought they were just bending some rules about property lines and building permits, but they ended up creating actual environmental hazards that could have affected our entire neighborhood. It's a reminder that our actions often have consequences, far beyond what we initially imagine. And let's talk about social media's role in all this. Sarah's need to document and broadcast everything actually ended up providing some of the best evidence against them. It's kind of poetic justice. The very platform she was using to showcase their rule-breaking became the tool that helped hold them accountable. But perhaps the most important lesson is about hubris and humility. The Hendersons thought they could outsmart everyone. The city planners, the environmental regulations, their neighbors, and even the basic laws of physics. Their fall from grace wasn't just about breaking rules. It was about the fundamental foolishness of thinking you're above the systems and regulations that keep our communities safe and functional. Now, whenever I look at my restored garden and that warning marker in their yard, I'm reminded that sometimes the best things in life come from working with nature and your community, not against them. My hydrangeas are thriving because I understood and respected the natural conditions they need to grow. The new rain garden is beautiful because it works with the land's natural drainage patterns instead of trying to force something unnatural. This whole situation made me think about something bigger than just a neighborhood dispute or an illegal pool. It made me realize how our society has started to prioritize appearance over substance, quick fixes over proper planning, and social media clout over real community values. Think about it. The Hendersons aren't unique. They're just a symptom of a larger trend we're seeing everywhere. People are so focused on creating these picture-perfect moments for their social media feeds that they forget about the foundation those moments are built on. It's like they're trying to build a mansion on quicksand and then acting surprised. When everything starts to sink, the whole influencer lifestyle that Sarah was chasing is particularly interesting to examine. She was so focused on creating content about their luxury transformation that she didn't stop to consider whether what they were doing was right, legal, or even physically possible. In her mind, if something would look good on Instagram, it had to be worth doing regardless of the consequences. This mentality has started seeping into how people approach home ownership and community living. Instead of seeing a home as a place to live and a community as something to be part of, people are treating them like movie sets, backdrops for their personal brand building. The Hendersons didn't see a neighborhood with history and established relationships. They saw a canvas for their social media content. But here's what's really fascinating. When everything fell apart, when their carefully curated image crumbled, like the unstable soil beneath their illegal pool, that's when real growth started to happen. Richard, stripped of his legal arrogance, actually started learning about proper property law. Sarah, forced to abandon her luxury lifestyle content, found a new and more authentic voice talking about learning from mistakes. It makes you wonder about all the other perfectly curated lives we see online. How many of them are built on similarly shaky foundations? How many people are one heavy rainstorm away from watching their carefully constructed facade wash away? The environmental aspect of this story is particularly relevant to our times. We're living in an era where people talk a lot about environmental consciousness, but when it comes to their personal projects, they often ignore the very real impact they're having on the natural world. The Hendersons' disaster shows how interconnected everything is, how one family's bad decisions about drainage and soil stability can affect an entire neighborhood's environmental health. And let's talk about the role of expertise in our society. We're living in a time where people often think they can Google their way to expertise, where watching a few YouTube videos somehow qualifies you to operate heavy machinery or redesign natural drainage patterns. The Hendersons' story is a perfect example of what happens when you substitute confidence for competence. But there's hope in this story too. The way our community came together after the incident, the reforms in the HOA, the new appreciation for proper procedures and environmental considerations, it shows that sometimes it takes a disaster to bring about positive change. Sometimes you need to watch someone's illegal pool turn into a sinkhole to remember why we have building codes in the first place. The warning marker in their yard has become more than just a judge's punishment. It's turned into a kind of modern cautionary tale. I've seen new homeowners stopping to read it, contractors pointing it out to clients, and even local school groups using it as part of their civic responsibility lessons. In a way, the Hendersons did end up influencing the neighborhood, just not in the way they originally planned. Their failure has become a powerful reminder of why we have rules and regulations, why we need to respect natural systems, and why cutting corners never really works out in the long run. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson here. True luxury isn't about having the biggest pool or the most impressive backyard. It's about building something sustainable, something that works with nature instead of against it, something that adds value to your community instead of disrupting it. So there you have it, folks. The complete story of how my neighbor's illegal pool project turned into one of the most expensive and embarrassing mistakes in our community's history. But before I wrap this up, I want to hear from all of you about your own experiences with entitled neighbors and HOA drama. Have you ever dealt with neighbors who thought the rules didn't apply to them? Maybe you've got your own story about someone trying to build something ridiculous without permits, or about an HOA president who let power go to their head. Drop your stories in the comments below. I read every single one, and some of them might even make it into future videos. And speaking of future videos, if you enjoyed this tale of karma and construction chaos, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We've got some amazing stories coming up, including one about a neighbor who tried to claim adverse possession of someone's entire garage while they were on vacation, and another about an HOA president who tried to ban all plants except artificial ones. Trust me, you won't want to miss these. For those of you asking in the comments, yes, the Hendersons still live next door. Yes, their warning marker is still there, getting plenty of attention from curious passers-by. And yes, my hydrangeas are doing better than ever. Thanks for asking. I've actually started giving gardening tips to some of the neighbors who were inspired by this whole incident to start their own gardens. Turns out, sometimes the best way to build community is through shared experiences, even if those experiences involve watching someone's illegal construction project turn into an impromptu pond. If you found this story helpful or entertaining, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel reach more people who might be dealing with similar situations. And remember, while it's easy to laugh at the Hendersons' mistakes, the real message here is about respecting your community, following proper procedures, and understanding that sometimes the best revenge is just letting karma do its thing while keeping really good records. For those of you interested in learning more about property rights and how to protect yourself from similar situations, I've put together a basic guide with resources and tips. You'll find the link in the description below. It's not legal advice. I'm an engineer, not a lawyer, but it might help you avoid ending up with an excavator-shaped lawn ornament. And hey, if you're watching this and thinking about building a pool, remember, get the proper permits. Respect property lines, and maybe don't live stream yourself breaking construction laws. Just a thought. Don't forget to join our Discord community, where we share even more neighborhood stories and support each other through HOA drama. We've got channels dedicated to gardening tips, property law discussions, and yes, even a space for sharing security camera footage of entitled neighbors doing entitled things. Next week's video is going to be wild. We're talking about a neighbor who decided to start a luxury chicken resort in their backyard without telling anyone. Let's just say it involves escaped chickens, angry HOA board members, and some very confused local health inspectors. You won't want to miss it. Until then, keep documenting everything, respect your property lines, and remember, sometimes the best content isn't the perfect Instagram post, but the real-life karma that comes from doing things the right way. Stay safe, stay legal, and I'll see you in the next video. And as always, keep those crazy neighbor stories coming, because trust me, just when you think you've heard it all, someone decides to build an illegal pool. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.